light, easy to handle, effective. The handgun is the ideal weapon for both defensive and offensive close-quarter man-to-man combat fighting. Easily carried at the side, it's practically a part of you. In spite of the weapon's light weight and compactness, a bullet smashing through only one of these white pine boards would be enough to seriously wound a man. Before handguns can be fired properly, men must first complete basic training with the pistol and revolver on a standard range. Here, trigger squeeze, sighting and aiming, and other fixed and correct firing habits are learned. This basic training, however, doesn't prepare a man to get the most out of his weapon in combat. For here on the range, he's firing under ideal conditions at stationary targets. Being a good shot on a range doesn't mean that a man will be the same good shot when the target is moving or firing back at him.
The pistol that won 2 world wars. Chambered in so-called God's caliber. And the most famous pistol of all time. From the brilliant mind of John Moses Browning, the model 1911. One cannot talk about the 1911 without briefly discussing its designer. John Moses Browning was born on January 23, 1855 in Ogden, Utah in the United States. His family practiced gunsmithing, and at an early age Browning's father introduced him to the profession, where he showed a high level of skill at the craft in very little time. By the age of 20, Browning designed his first firearm, which was a single-shot rifle. This design impressed the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, which led to Browning obtaining a partnership with the owners. He would design various firearms for Winchester for 20 years. After 20 years with Winchester, Browning became more frustrated with his lack of control over products and designs. So he packed his suitcase and began partnerships with various companies, such as Colt, Remington, and F.N. Herstal. By the late 1800s, Browning was beginning to tamper with self-loading handgun designs. The U.S. military had been looking for a new handgun to replace their aging revolvers, which dated back to the Civil War. Browning would design the Colt Model 1900, which utilized his own short recoil operating system. This would be Colt's first semi-automatic handgun, and the design would be a breakthrough for Browning, which led him to designing future handguns such as the 1911 and the Browning High Power. In 1926, while at the Belgian F.N. Herstal factory, he would suffer a heart attack and pass away at the age of 71. In the early 1900s, America was at war in the Philippines against insurgents who were fighting for their country's independence after the American victory during the Spanish-American War. America had annexed Philippine Islands after their victory against the Spaniards in 1898, and had not anticipated how hard their foes were willing to fight for their land. Many skirmishes resulted in close-quarters combat, especially in ambush scenarios, which were a primary tactic of the Filipino fighters. This led to U.S. troops having to rely on the revolvers, which were chambered in .38 Special. The Filipino fighters were able to shrug off multiple of these rounds, leading to many unfortunate situations for the U.S. troops. In 1899 and into 1900, various self-loading pistols were tested, such as the Colt Model 1900 and the Mauser C96, affectionately titled the Broom Handle. However, with the failures of the .38 Special round, a new requirement was listed. This requirement was that the handgun could be chambered in a round no smaller than .45, which immediately disqualified all the pistols that had already been in testing. The U.S. Army went back to using their old M1873 single-action revolvers in .45 Colt for a short period of time. However, it wasn't long before Browning would return with a new design which would amaze everyone. This would be in 1906, and alongside Browning's new design, multiple other notable companies such as Luger, Savage Arms, and Webley would also provide their own handguns for testing. These designs had their own issues, which would have to be fixed. However, only Savage Arms and Colt would remedy these issues and resubmit them. Luger would withdraw from the competition, even though it was very promising and might have even had a chance of winning if Luger had continued with the contest. A number of field tests would be conducted between 1907 to decide between Savage's and Browning's designs. One of the most notable events that would happen during the testing was one test of the 1911, which was used to shoot 6,000 rounds over the course of 2 days while periodically being submerged in water to cool down. It would fire all 6,000 rounds without a single malfunction. Browning happened to be in attendance for this test, and I think it's fair to say that he knew he had won right then and there. After the success of Browning's design during the testing process, he would win the contract, and the M1911 would be formally adopted by the U.S. Army on March 29, 1911. The Navy and the Marines would both adopt the M1911 in 1913 and would go on to use the handgun to great success during the Great War. World War I would introduce an entire generation of young men to trench warfare and close quarters battle, which had first been seen in the American Civil War, which according to many historians was the beginning of modern combat. The M1911 was a perfect option for storming trenches, allowing the soldier to maneuver more freely while at the same time giving them a handgun chambered in a competent round, which decimated anyone standing in its way. The pistol was a favorite of any troop given it, and proved to be capable of surpassing intense combat conditions. After World War I, troops would share stories of their experience with the handguns, some of which were negative, but mostly positive. This led to military armorers making subtle changes to the pistol. In 1924, the M1911A1 would be introduced and later adopted in 1926. The A1 would introduce several new features to the handgun, such as a shorter trigger, a longer and more pronounced grip safety, frame changes to improve grip, trigger relief cuts, a shorter hammer to prevent hammer bite, a slightly enlarged rear and front sight, and a parkerized finish to prevent corrosion. The M1911 and M1911A1 remained in service with the U.S. military until 1985, and would be used in several conflicts such as World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. The 1911 proved useful in each of these conflicts. However, over time, handguns in general became a less and less commonly used weapon in frontline combat. This is for a myriad of reasons. During the war, the 1911 was still useful for most troops to have, although they didn't, as pistols were usually only handed to higher-ups and rear echelon troops. But with the lack of body armor for most troops and a lot of close quarters combat, the 1911 was still in its prime. As combat evolved and CQB scenarios became more scarce, the 1911 started to lose its significance though. The 1911 was a favorite amongst tunnel rats though, which were US troops who were tasked with maneuvering Viet Cong tunnels which were laid with traps and filled with hostiles. In these cramped tunnels, an M16 was not a viable option to drag down the hole with you, at least not in most tunnels. This led to tunnel rats choosing a variety of light and compact handguns, as well as some shotguns, but mainly revolvers chambered in .38 Special and of course the 1911. The 1911 was the preferred choice though, as its higher round count, semi-auto function, and lightweight led to it proving itself as the go-to handgun for clearing tunnels during the Vietnam War. After the war, the 1911 was beginning to show its age. After 64 years of service, the US military was starting to look for a replacement. By the late 70s, Congress was applying pressure to the military to obtain a standardized handgun for all branches. This led to the Air Force starting the Joint Service Small Arms Program, which went on to look for a new handgun now required to be chambered in 9mm. After several years of trials, the M1911 and 1911A1 would be replaced in standard units with the Beretta 92F, marking the end of an era of perfected handgun technology for its time. In the 80s, Marine Corps Colonel Robert Young listed a series of improvements for Browning's design to make it ready for 21st century combat, many of which were used in the MUSOC M45. During the same time, many Delta Force operators were using personally customized 1911s. These were not M45s, although some of them did share similar parts and aesthetics. The original M45s would be built off of old M1911A1 frames and were put together by armorers in Quantico, Virginia. Some of the frames dated back to the First World War and had modernized parts added to them. These handguns would serve Marine Special Forces well, but by the early 2000s the MUSOC M45 was calling for more upgrades. This led to USMC armorers to purchase off-the-wall civilian products to put together a new handgun. Some of these parts were from reputable companies such as Wilson Combat and Springfield Armory, as well as lesser-known companies, at least to me, like Novak and Nowlin Manufacturing. Wilson Combat would provide extractors and mag releases. Springfield would provide slides. Nowlin Manufacturing would provide most of the internals, including the barrels. Front sight pins, beaver tail safeties, and recoil springs would be from Ed Brown. And King's Gun Works would provide ambidextrous safeties, bringing together a hodgepodge of different companies' parts and resulting in a damn good firearm. By the mid-2010s, refurbishing old 1911 frames into modernized handguns was becoming less common. Instead, Colt would begin manufacturing M45s themselves, and these pistols would be used until 2012 with the release of the M45A1 CQBP. However, there was also a brief testing process of a Kimbermain 1911 which was titled the ICQB, the I being for interim, as it was tested just before the adoption of the M45A1. The A1 was Colt's new iteration of the 1911. Instead of building off of old frames, Colt went ahead and designed a new frame and new gun entirely, well except for the fact that it was still a 1911. The M45A1 would feature several notable changes in comparison to the M45. The M45A1 was made of stainless steel. This made the pistol slightly heavier, but the real addition to the weight of the pistol was the addition of a Picatinny rail to the bottom of the frame, for the ability to mount lights and laser aiming modules. The A1 is also obviously a different color, coming in a desert tan Cerakote finish. This finish added to the overall corrosion and rust resistance of the frame, but is very easy to rub off with consistent usage with a holster. I personally got the opportunity to talk with a former recon Marine who has time behind the M45A1, and this is what he had to say.
I got mine issued to me during my time in 1st Recon from 2017 to 2018. So while the ones we used had seen their fair share of usage, they had been maintained better than the M9s in regular service. We also put a lot of fucking rounds through them, and for the most part they held up. A couple of ours had to be sent to armors for general maintenance, but nothing crazy, so I'd say they were an 8.5 out of 10 on reliability.
I asked him about his preferences around mag capacity and cartridge type, and this is what he had to say.
I was not personally a fan of the single-stack 45. We deployed to the Horn of Africa, which notoriously the guys up there are on a lot of drugs. They can shrug off a couple 9mm shots, so 45 is the go-to. But only having a single-stack mag was fucking bullshit. We worked anti-piracy and had to ride in boats often, and on boats you rely on your sidearm heavily, because the spaces can be so confined. So the likelihood of you being in a gunfight with your handgun is much higher, and then you have less ammo, which sucks. So you take your good with the bad there, but something like a Glock 21 or HK USB have double-stacked 45 mags, and I would have rather had one of those. Granted, I'd take an M45A1 over an issued M9 any day of the week, just because of the stopping power, and we could carry a lot of extra mags. Plus, it's not the first thing I'd be pulling out anyways. My IAR is for that.
Then he gave me his honest opinion.
To be honest, I'd rate it like a 3 out of 10, but that's purely shooter's preference. To me, it was heavy and bulky in the wrong ways, flat and awkward in also the wrong ways, and again, 9 shots sucks. There are far better 45s out there. On paper though, it's probably a good 8.5 to 9 out of 10.
I wasn't able to interview multiple people, unfortunately, so we only have the opinion of one person with experience behind the gun. Some people hate it, but most people love it, and since 2013, civilians have been able to procure their own. Since the early 2020s, civilians have also been given the option for budget versions of the M45A1, such as the TSAS Raider, which comes in the same tan paint scheme. The M45A1 would end up being phased out of the Marine Corps in 2022. However, with the safety issues seen with the M18, it might be possible to see the M45A1 come out of retirement for a short period of time. Or maybe I'm just being optimistic. The 1911 is one of the best pistols of all time, with some of the richest history behind it out of all firearms. From storming trenches in the day of horse and buggy to being carried on the hips of pilots flying fighter jets, the 1911 was there by the side of the U.S. military for over 110 years, saving the lives of its users and taking the lives of the enemy day after day for over a century, and to this day continues to be used by various militaries and law enforcement agencies worldwide. The 1911 has stood the test of time and has proven itself as one of the most effective military handguns ever built, and I'm sure Browning would be happy with his invention. As always, thank you for watching. This has been Matthew from Discreet Resolve Coalition, and I will see you next time.